Good afternoon. This is John Fishwick. I'm here today with Zach Van Patten, our firm investigator, Daniel Martin, who's an associate with our firm who spoke last week. And this week joining us is Kerin Daly, who's a legal assistant with our firm. Kerin went to North Crawl School here in Roanoke and was a graduate of William & Mary College. And she's very interested in treasure hunting. And Daniel's very interested in the law of treasure hunting. So this week we thought we'd have a little fun. We've been talking about very serious matters, the governor's orders and the Constitution. This year we thought we'd try to liven people's lives up a little bit. Looking for treasure is great exercise. It's a lot of fun, and the laws are fun too. So we thought we'd expand everyone's horizons this week. I'm usually, as everybody knows, in a coat and tie, but we're all dressed up a little differently to have fun with this. So Zach, you're always our host. Why don't you lead things off with some questions to folks?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things I do want to say, it was kind of funny. We were trying to figure out what we were going to call this episode. You know, we had things from, lawyers, guns, and money. And, but I got to give a shout out to my friend Sandy Workman. She said Indiana Jones and the Temple of Zoom. So I thought that was, pretty good. But Kerin, I think you actually have a better story for us this morning, don't you?
Yeah, I do. It's about the SS Central America called the Ship of Gold, and I taglined it, "The Treasure Found to be Lost." So the story starts in August 1857 when passengers in gold start their journey to New York from San Francisco, California, and they sail to Panama and take a train to the ship, the SS Central America, that in 4 years had 43 voyages and a third of all the gold from California to New York. Wow. And this big operation was underwritten by insurance companies in New York and London because gotta protect that gold. So they finally get to the ship, and at its helm is Captain William Hurdon, a Navy commander who was very capable, but a storm quickly turned to a hurricane, and they found a leak. And so they valiantly tried bailing it out. 100 men, women, and children were rescued. But unfortunately, 400 people and I think $1 million in gold sank 8,000 miles below the surface, 160 miles off the coast of South Carolina. And actually, this contributed to the Panic of 1857 because gold was currency. And so people were freaking out. Even though the insurance company paid it, everyone was real worried. But the real question is this treasure cursed? And maybe it is. Well, it really has an interesting story after they find it. So I think there were some other things about it being cursed previously. But the story we're going to talk about is Tommy G. Thompson, who was an oceanic engineer. And he convinced 161 investors to contribute $12 million. And he had this ocean robot named Nemo. And they did all these calculations. Columbia did a paper on it about how they figured out where it would be with the currents and how things moved. And they did the impossible, and they found it. And they brought up 3 tons, which sounds like a lot, but actually was just scratching the surface, worth millions of dollars. And they're like, oh, we'll come back for this. But little did they know, 39 insurance companies were waiting for them, saying that they insured that gold and it's theirs. So it took a decade, and Daniel will talk more about the legal aspects of these types of things. But eventually they did get 92.2% of the treasure after a decade. But in 2000, Tommy Thompson was out a lot of money. And so he needed to pay his expenses and for all these legal fees. So he sold some of the gold to the California Marketing Group. And the investors didn't see this money that they were promised. So they got a little concerned. So there was a slew of legal cases. And 2012 was a bad year for Tommy Thompson. He tried to file for bankruptcy, which the court wasn't buying. And then he had a contempt of court hearing in federal court that he failed to show up for, which led to a 2-year manhunt. And a U.S. Marshal, I think, said he was one of the smartest or best fugitives he'd ever seen. And they were living in this mansion in Florida. And they finally tracked it down. But when they arrived, it was just phones $10,000 in cash, and there's different variations, but one source says a book about how to invade law enforcement. And so they showed up to his house, thought they had him, but he wasn't on the run forever. In January 2015, they found him and his girlfriend, who was previously his assistant, in a Florida hotel with 4 phones and $6,500 in cash. So he pled guilty to contempt of court, and kind of said, "Oh, I think because with him there were 500 missing coins," and he's like, "Oh, I think they're in Belize. Like, I'll nail it down for you." But he did not follow through, and the judge was not amused. So he was fined $1,000 a day, and was definitely indefinitely sitting in jail until he told them where it was. And finally, in November 2018, there was a settlement where he's like, "Oh, I'll turn over the missing treasure if you let me go." But a couple days later, he couldn't remember where it was. And so they know that in 2010, his girlfriend gave over the coins to an unidentified person in a storage unit. And somehow he only remembers the phone call and that it might be in Belize. That's where the trust was. But can't say for sure, but the judge really didn't buy this memory issue. He also at one point said it was about safety, but would need more time to say who he needed safety from. Also tried saying he was entitled to it. So yeah, the judge was very not amused, and continued the $1,000 a day. And as of yesterday, he is still in prison, and his release date is indefinite. But there was good news for the people, his investors and his backers. In the end of November 2018, they received $19.4 million compensatory damages. And last year, 13 of the backers, I think from Seattle, Washington, finally received their money, and they had a 30-year court battle to get it. And so the man who was able to get the technology, the people, the robot, to find this impossible treasure, managed to hide himself from law enforcement, and we still don't know where part of this treasure is. So that's the story.
Nice. It's funny you say that. I mean, yeah, I got to give him props for not giving up, sticking to his guns and not giving up the treasure. But, that brings us to the point that there still is treasure out there. A lot of people, scoff at the fact that, oh, buried treasure, this and that. But I know John in our own office, our own Amy Guthrie, she's our resident treasure expert. She knows the locations or the purported locations of all these buried treasures, throughout the state and all across the nation. But that leads me to, so Daniel, I'm going to hit you up with this. Say I wanted to go out and hunt for treasure on my own. What are some of the parameters I got to keep in mind on this?
Well, you have to keep in mind both state and federal law. Under federal law, there are a couple of laws that have been passed that kind of, limit your ability to just go out and, hunt for treasure, especially when you're on federal land. There's the Antiquities Act, which prohibits you from, doing any kind of treasure excavation, which includes going out onto federal land, with a metal detector to search for treasure. So you can't just, go to a national park. If you think treasure is buried in a national park, you can't just go there with a metal detector and sort of disturb, the pristine national park. That's prohibited by law. And, beyond that, even if you do find treasure on federal land, they're going to have a claim of ownership over that treasure if it's, historical, which most treasure tends to be, even if it's just, gold or coins. And there's also the Archaeological Resources Protection Act of 1979, which defines an archaeological resource as any material or remains of past human life or activities which are of archaeological interest, which, a lot of treasure would fall into that category. So even if you have a permit, archaeological resources which are excavated from public lands are the property of the United States. And Virginia has a similar sort of law where if you're on state-owned land, you can't, go onto the land with a metal detector and start searching for treasure and disturbing, that environment. And if you do, that treasure is going to belong to the state, usually. And so I know you've, in your law enforcement past, you've dealt with some of these sorts of issues with people, trespassing onto land with metal detectors and that sort of thing. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I don't know so much about treasure hunting, but one time it was later on at night, and I saw like a flashlight beam. I happened to be in a graveyard in the jurisdiction I was in, and I didn't know what the hell the guy was doing. And he had a what do you call it? Yeah, a metal detector, and he was out there, and he was looking, and he said he was within his rights because it was his family, and what he was doing, I don't know exactly what he was doing, but he was scanning the graves of his ancestors and his buried loved ones. So needless to say, we had a talk, and he understood and he left. But that's as close as I've come to metal detecting and treasure hunting in my law enforcement career. I know when John was U.S. attorney, and I worked with him, we had some cases, and we would get some occasional calls on, treasure on battlefields and on federal forest land. But that's about the extent of my experience with it.
And I think it's important to mention that, these federal statutes, they don't come into play too often because, treasure hunting is not a very common activity, but they are invoked. For example, there's a case from Texas from 2012, which was United States versus Nunley, Heath, Jenkins, and Carrasco. And they were convicted of using a metal detector in a national park to search for lost treasures, and they were actually fined $1,000. They were banned from national parks for a year, and, they had to forfeit the metal detectors. So, losses all around.
Well, let me ask you this, Daniel. Now, this might actually be a question and a topic for another webisode, but what about wreck diving, like international waters and the treasure out in the ocean, that sort of thing? Is that kind of fall under what we're talking about today, or is that for another time?
It does, in a sense. And I can go back to the case that Kerin was talking about involving the SS Central America. Now, the issue there that the Fourth Circuit, and the reason why, we have why it was an actual case, was because it wasn't clear whether the law of finders applies or the law of salvage applied. The law of finders is basically finders keepers. If you find property that's been abandoned or lost, the finder gets to keep it. Finders keepers. That's the rule. And on the other hand, with the law of salvage, which involves maritime and admiralty law, with the law of salvage, the owner hasn't abandoned that property, so the salvager gets to kind of keep a fee, basically a cut of the treasure for finding it, for salvaging it, but the property right remains with the original owner. Okay. And in that case, the case involving the SS Central America, the district court had found that the law of finders applied, but the Fourth Circuit said no, the law of admiralty applies because this gold, it wasn't abandoned, voluntarily by the people on that ship, back in 1857. It was just,
that was John's time period.
It was lost at sea.
John, you recall that, right? 1857. That was your time period, right? Do you remember seeing the headlines?
That's nice, Zach. I guess you, for the time being, are our host. I'm not sure how much longer that's going to last, but for the time being, you are. But yes, I do remember that time. I was in my teens in 1850s.
Well,
it was a good time.
Do you have any input on to segue in or to piggyback on to what Daniel was talking about?
No, I think Daniel's exactly right. I think it gets a little more complex when you're dealing with the ocean and sunken treasure and ships. And so that becomes more complex, more interesting cases for lawyers and for judges to figure out. But I think Daniel's identified what you have to look at there.
Now, it was around 1857 where you wrote your law article about salvage. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. Now, that's true. I did a long time ago. I'm not sure it was quite that long ago, but it was close. I did write an article about that.
Well, I would like to say, to our audience, if you have a topic or something you'd like to hear us talk about, please, just comment below, let us know, and we'd be glad to do the research and have that on a future webisode. So, please like, subscribe, and comment below. And I think that does it for us today. Does anybody else have anything?
No, thank you, Zach. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Kerin.
Absolutely. You guys be safe.
Everyone be safe. Bye-bye.